All right, here's our tutorial video for our daily review, question number 5, which is asking us about multiples. And as always, you can check the link in the description down below to find timestamps for specific parts of this problem. So there's a couple of things for us to know when we're describing multiples. And so I'm going to describe some of our vocabulary pieces that might be helpful for us. So the first thing is that multiples are the numbers that you get when you multiply a number. And you can see I underline that word multiply because multiply and multiples kind of sound similar, and those words actually are very related to each other, which is why they sound like each other. So just remember that multiples are the numbers that you get when you multiply a number. You should also know that there are always an infinite number of multiples. So if I were to ask you for the multiples of 100 or the multiples of 3, both of those have an infinite number of multiples to them. And we'll see that here in just a minute when we do some examples of multiples. The other thing to remember is that multiples is sometimes thought of as skip counting. You might have heard about skip counting in younger grades, in like grade 3 or 4. You guys probably did some skip counting. And multiples is really the same thing as skip counting, but when we're describing multiples, we're talking about ways that we are multiplying a number. So let's go ahead and take a look at our multiples first. We'll do a couple examples of multiples, and then we'll also take a look at what the least common multiple is. I'm also going to show at the end of this video a trick or a way that you can use a multiplication chart to help you find multiples of numbers. So let's go ahead and get some numbers here. So in general, we're going to have a couple for our daily review. We'll always have 2, but you can do multiples of more than that as well. So here I'm going to have 2 numbers, the number 2 and the number 10. We've described this as kind of skip counting or when we multiply. So if I think about the number 2, when I multiply 2, 2 times 1 is 2, 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 3 is 6, 2 times 4 is 8. I've just listed the first 4 multiples, and again, you can think about that as skip counting. 2, 4, 6, 8. That is all that we have done there, is we've skip counted those numbers, or we've multiplied 2 times 1, 2 times 2, 2 times 3, 2 times 4. We could do the exact same thing for our multiples of 10. 10 times 1 is 10, 10 times 2 is 20, and 10 times 3 is 30. And again, we could also think about this as skip counting 10, 20, 30. Now, that is how we find multiples. We're also asked how to find, in this problem, we are asked to find the least common multiple. And the least common multiple is simply the smallest number that appears in both lists. Now, 2 is the smallest number, but 2 is not in both lists. It's only in one list. So we want to look for a number that shows up in both lists. And if I look through my list of 2, and then I look through my list of 10, I'm going to notice that there are no numbers that are in both of those lists. However, we need to remember that multiples are always infinite. There's always an infinite number of multiples. And so I could continue either or both of these lists as needed until I were to find something that was in common. In this case, it's pretty simple. I can simply count one more multiple of 2, and I'm going to see that now I have a multiple in common. So that's the process to find multiples and to find the least common multiple. One quick tip is just pay attention. If you have a small number and a large number, generally speaking, you are going to have a lot more of the multiples of that smaller number until you find something that's in common. And so you can see that we had 5 multiples of that smaller number, and we only needed 1 multiple of our larger number. So the more spread out that those are, just make sure that you're thinking that smaller number might need more and more multiples. Let's go ahead and take a look at how you might use a multiplication chart to help you out with this. Oops, I forgot to write down there. Our least common multiple is 10. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we could use a multiplication chart to help us out with this process. So here I have a multiplication chart, and I've chosen two numbers. We could have done 2 and 10, but we already know those. So I'm going to do 2 and 6. Now, I've circled 2 in red and 6 in blue, and I'm going to go ahead and look at the multiples for both of those. Well, in this case, I've just circled those things in blue and red. So the box that's made around my 2 column, all of those are multiples. And when we say that this is infinite, you can imagine that that list goes on forever, right? This happens to be a multiplication chart that's being multiplied up to 10, but we could think about a bigger multiplication chart that went up to 20 or 30 or 40 or infinity, right? And that list of 2's, skip counting by 2's, would continue. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24, 26, 28, 30, etc., etc. And we would do the same thing for 6. Now in this case, I've simply highlighted any of the common multiples. 6, 12, and 18 were common multiples. And you could also imagine, you could kind of see I put a dot over on the right, because we know that this list continues to extend. Even though 24 is not on my 2 list, we know that it would be there if I were to continue. And in fact, you might see this happen sometimes where our multiples of 6 actually are all in common with 2. All of those show up in both the 2 list and the 6 list. However, not all of the multiples in the 2 list are in the 6 list. For example, 8 never shows up in our multiples of 6, or 14 never shows up in our multiples of 6. So this is, again, just giving us an opportunity to see our different ways that we are looking at our multiples. And then finally, when we're trying to find that least common multiple, all we have to do is identify what's the smallest number that was in both of those lists. In this case, it was 6. Now, I wanted to take a look at one final example because those first 2 examples we looked at were kind of similar, and so I wanted to see one that was a little bit different. So here I have picked 2 different numbers, 3 and 7, and again, that process is the same. I can circle my multiples of 3 and my multiples of 7. All of those things are multiples. Then I'm going to look for multiples that are in common. In this case, I'm looking for things that are in common. I see 21 shows up in both lists. Now, remember that these lists extend. And so there are more common multiples of 3 and 7 than just what's there. There are other things that would appear if I continued this list. However, those are the multiples that I have, and so that's what we are working with right now. And I just want the smallest one that's in both lists. Well, in this case, we have already identified that smallest one, and that is the number 21 is our least common multiple. So that gives you an opportunity to work with our multiples. And thank you guys so much for spending the time to take a look at our tutorials for our weekly review.